Gabe Morrison is a PhD candidate studying English with a focus on writing studies at UConn. His dissertation research explores the ways writing crosses modalities, languages, and communities. And the website that's hosting this project will be the first fully born digital dissertation at UConn. Gabe's other research interests include composition pedagogy, writing across the curriculum, and graduate level writing. And Gabe, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for this opportunity to be able to present at this symposium. My presentation is entitled Crossing Rhetorics, and my background as a scholar interested in writing pedagogy means that I am interested not only in the media of tomorrow, but also in the ways that we will teach students to creatively make use of this media. This is very much a work in progress, and I am fortunate to have this opportunity to try out some of these ideas alongside such an impressive cast of scholars. Before I begin, I want to say a few words about how you might want to access this presentation. While I will be sharing slides, I've also included a link to them in the resources section of the conference platform, and I encourage you to open this on your own. If you open the slides, you also have the option of opening the presentation script for this talk, if you would like to read alongside or keep a copy to reference later. This presentation is an assemblage of fragments. The temporally linear and limited text of my voice as I speak is not the presentation. It is a part, as are the slides, which are presented as a web space for you to explore at your own pace. As I speak, I encourage you to read ahead and to get distracted. Explore the fragments I have assembled in the ways that you want to. Watch the videos and click on the links in the presentation if you like. Much of these fragments are not strictly necessary. I won't mention all of them. And I encourage you to ignore the fragments that don't interest you. In other words, there are multiple ways to access this presentation, and I want you to find the access paths that are most meaningful for you. You can also access through the link that's shown on the screen, tinyurl.com/crossing-rhetorics. I want to start with a few fragments from the last year, the pandemic year, because to talk about crossing is to talk about boundaries and fractures, and this was a year of fractures. Here are some images that many of us have become familiar with over the last few months. Remarkable photographs from Thomas Dworzak, you might have seen published recently in The Atlantic, which document the pandemic through Zoom. Zoom has in some ways flattened our existence in literal and figurative senses, but at the same time, it has unflattened and expanded our lives too, creating windows that let us observe the interweaving, or what writing scholars Paul Pryor and Jody Shipko would call lamination of work and home, places and times, the virtual and the real. These Zoom screens, I think, highlight in a visual way how our lives have become fragmented and how we have had to learn to transfer and transform our practices for different media environments. To speak of futures at this moment is in some ways strange and timely, because we are living in a future where we interact with media and technologies in ways very few of us would have predicted 2 years ago. So in this presentation, I'm not going to forecast anything except the fact that we are likely to make many wrong guesses about what the future may bring. What may be a fairly safe prediction then is that using the future's media will require flexibility, dexterity, and adaptability. I want to share one more fragment, which is a description of my own writing process for this presentation. And it comes from a brilliant question that my mentor, Dr. Brenda Brueggemann, once asked me, which was, how do you access writing? And it made me think about all the ways that my writing is a process of crossing between media. As I researched, I access texts from the library, which are digitized from print, which were created using word processors, which trail off into remediations that I can't know. I remediate these texts again by listening to these documents with a text-to-speech program. This is how I do almost all of my academic reading these days. I listen while I walk around my neighborhood, and I notice that I attach memories of passages that I've heard to specific locations on my walking route. So my physical world becomes a part of the text. As I listen, I take notes by speaking them into my phone, and Evernote transmits these notes to my computer, which then often becomes a drawing, and then writing, and then speech, like the speech that you're hearing now. It's a dizzying universe of crossing points. No one taught me to write like this. I learned through necessity and the rather unique opportunity for metacognition, which is undertaking doctoral study in writing activity and processes. I'm not saying that these specific practices are the ways people have to write for the future, but increasingly a transmediated process is the way people do write. And are there many or any places in our education systems that acknowledge this or set students up to be able to adjust to sudden transitions and uncertain futures? Increasingly, writing involves crossing. Juan Guerra says that contemporary literacy environments are a Deleuzian rhizomatic landscape that he terms the neither nor, which resembles a fragmented, discontinuous, and disorienting social space that the disenfranchised post-colonial subjects must learn to navigate and negotiate. The neither nor is measured by its never-ending fluidity, instability, and unpredictability. Today's writers, he contends, must learn to use cultural modalities of memory to highlight the rhizomatic nature of their lived experience, to wrestle with the multiple contradictions that life in the neither nor, in particular, brings to light. When we constitute or reconstitute ourselves, we purposefully disrupt the need that we feel to make sense of the world in coherent and highly prescribed terms. Today's writers must write across geographical boundaries, across media and platforms, across technologies and interfaces, languages and cultures, political divides, bodies, identities, communities. Crossing is powerful. It is relational. It brings things together, combines associatively. It is also transgressive. It shows us where lines have been drawn and invites us to change course. For Deleuze and Guattari, crossing implies a kind of horizontal movement that contrasts with the linearity of Western modernist production. They describe assemblage as a form of crossing by bringing objects into surprising points of intersection through juxtaposition. Every point of crossing has at least two dimensions and invites plural engagements with the place where things meet. For those of us who work with media and text, perhaps our fascination with crossing owes itself to metaphors that permeate our culture at the level of language. The word text derives from the Latin texere, which means to weave, literally to create material by cross-hatching threads. Writing has always been a technology of crossing. Recently, the field of literacy studies and other disciplines have been experiencing something that has been referred to as a quote-unquote trans turn. The concept of transliteracies is in some ways reminiscent of the New London Group's foundational definition of multiliteracies and their taxonomy of communicative modes. But unlike the separating of modes visualized in this diagram by the New London Group, transliteracies emphasize fluid crossings and braiding of modes, contexts, and materialities. This emerging transliteracies framework aims to dissolve boundaries and draw attention to mobility, how meaning and power are intertwined, the material and the social, the multiple ways of knowing, and activity. The transliteracies framework attempts to trace the ways that writing and especially writers move across boundaries. However, this evolving framework thus far has served as a methodology for studying writing rather than doing writing. While more empirical studies of transliterate practices will hopefully eventually yield methods for teaching and doing, in the near term we need a rhetoric, a crossing rhetoric, that provides viable and practical heuristics for writers and literacy educators. In order to imagine the communicative techniques that are increasingly demanded by life in the neither nor, I looked to the past, to the ancient rhetorical technique of chiasmus, to construct a vision of what the future's crossing rhetoric could look like. I focus on 5 qualities of the rhetorical trope and expand them to different scales and kinds of media. Many of us will be immediately familiar with examples of chiasmus. On the sentence level, it is the reversal of grammatical structures in successive phrases or clauses, or the A-B-B-A pattern of mirror inversion, which creates a beguiling, crisscrossing logic that recycles similar words or syntax to turn an idea on its head. So some common examples, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, Kennedy. Who dotes yet doubts, suspects yet strongly loves, Shakespeare. The pattern can repeat and invert the same words or simply similar ideas, as in the Shakespeare example. The pattern can expand beyond the confines of a sentence to shape an entire text. Lund, for example, has exhaustively diagrammed chiastic structures in the New Testament, while Miller has noted that Martin Luther King Jr., influenced by biblical psalms and contemporary poets, used chiastic parallelism to structure many of his speeches. Despite its scalability to different levels of a text, chiasmus has most often been viewed as a rather limited rhetorical or literary curiosity, not relevant to the most urgent questions about audience, context, and ethics that have concerned rhetorical theorists for centuries. However, I would like to recast chiasmus as more than a mere figure of speech, as it has most often been characterized. I would like to also imagine chiasmus as a more expansive rhetorical framework and generative topos that can guide our approach to composing and interpreting texts. This expansion and rewriting of chiasmus defines it as a crossing rhetoric, a rhetoric that is self-aware, perhaps even playful, about the ways it crosses, combines, inverts ideas, stances, languages, media, bodies, and other traditionally bounded systems. In what follows, when I refer to chiasmus, I do not only mean the limited syntactic and organizational structures of the classical figure. My definition of chiasmus is a definition of crossing rhetoric. That is, rhetoric that deliberately and self-consciously connects, mirrors, spatializes, highlights relationships, or leaves unresolved ambiguities. Crossing rhetoric is always attuned to the gaps, to the slippages and indeterminacies of meaning. So I'm going to lay out 5 principles of chiasmus and crossing rhetoric now. So chiasmus is inherently visual and spatial. Chiasmus is derived from the Greek letter X, chi, because the inverted phrases form a metaphorical X, or crossing point. The X metaphor makes chiasmus an inherently visual device. Chiasmus is a pattern, a rhetorical pathway, and visual metaphors offer a way of tracing this pathway. An X, however, may not be the only way to represent chiasmus. Scholars who have theoretically explored the concept of chiasmus have found a number of ways to conceptualize it outside of the traditional X. Tyler, for example, draws a number of thought pictures to represent the mutant subjectivities caused by the chiastic splitting and joining of different identities or paradigms coming into contact. Drawing and visual metaphors capture the movement of chiasmus better than language does, because visual and spatial modes allow for the simultaneity and ambiguity that crossing rhetoric embraces. Chiasmus can be a mirror or a bridge. At its most basic level, chiasmus is about relationships. Chiasmus's ability to organize relationships can take place at the largest and smallest units of meaning. As the previous section illustrated, the nature of those relationships may be described through a variety of metaphors extending beyond the traditional X. In order for there to be a crossing, there must be 2 bodies or streams of meaning which meet at the crossing point. This connecting relationship need not be represented as oppositional, as the traditional X metaphor of chiasmus tends to suggest. A crossing point can be framed as an access point, where two distinct approaches overlap, as is the case in a literal bridge. Foot and motor traffic are allowed to proceed above, while water, vessels, and aquatic animals can pass by below. Bridge chiasmi are figures where readers are invited to consider something from multiple directions. An example is translation between languages, or captions on an image or television, where two communicative modes overlap and create multiple channels of access without precisely replicating the other. We might also think of chiasmus' tendency to connect as a resonance or association rather than a direct overlap, the rhetorical force that holds two terms or ideas in tension with each other. This kind of chiasmus maintains a gap, a leap audiences must make between the two chiastic poles, but the relationship is still organized according to a deliberate, if occasionally mysterious, logic. Rather than a bridge, this chiasmus perhaps most closely resembles atomic bonds or planetary orbits. Chiasmus has been traditionally employed to make a turn, a phrase double back on itself, and to invert an idea. So, for example, you must eat to live, not live to eat. Socrates. This rhetorical sleight of hand is powerful because it presents an opposing viewpoint in terms of the argument the rhetor wants to bolster by literally mirroring its words and grammar. It is a sneaky way to argue one side of an issue because the mirror image of the form suggests unbiased evenness. But chiasmus doesn't always favor one of the elements over the other, and mirroring isn't always reversal. Mirrors also create symmetry, unity. This construction persuades through balance, exploiting our human desire for resolution. The satisfying completion achieved by chiasmus' symmetry creates a sense of logical inevitability, a feeling that all sides of an argument have been accounted for. Chiasmus recycles semiotic resources. Chiasmus has been a popular trope among orators for centuries, in large part because it provides scaffolding for so many of rhetoric's canons: invention, style, memory. Chiasmus supports each of these canons through one of its signature traits, repetition. However, when chiasmus reuses semiotic resources, there is also always change. Chiasmus makes the old new again, with new syntactic ordering, a new placement, or a new point of view. Chiasmus demonstrates how recycling doesn't necessarily correlate to sameness. Each time the same content appears in a new context, it creates something new. New juxtapositions create new crossing points and thus new meanings. Chiasmus is a form of play. Part of chiasmus' rhetorical power is its sense of play, both in the sense that chiasmus is playful, entertaining, an invitation to a kind of linguistic game, perhaps even a form of intellectual trickery, but also play in the sense of the space through which a thing can or does move, like the slack of a fishing line that has hooked something in motion, the opportunity or room for action that a chiastic phrase leaves open. That is, chiasmus invokes rhetorical possibility within constraints. Like a game, chiasmus persuades through inviting audiences to play. Crossing rhetoric is interactive, democratic in the sense that everyone gets a chance to participate. It persuades through what Bogost calls procedural rhetoric, similarly to what games do, by authoring arguments through processes and through the construction of dynamic models. It is chiasmus' dynamism that attracts us, and the limiting but not deterministic set of rules that prompt audiences to do chiasmus and not simply read chiasmus. And finally, chiasmus is a way of entertaining multiple perspectives. So Harriman writes, chiasmus works not simply through a logic of crossing or exchange between two terms, but also through the generation of a third term that becomes the bridge between the original pairing. The generative power of the reversal comes from consciously having to supply something to cross the chasm between the original set and its inverted double. The crossing pattern proves to be most powerful, not because it compares by inverting binary terms, but because in doing so, it supplies a new term as the common ground on which the contrasting propositions can stand together. So Scott McCloud does this iconically through the example of the gutter in comics, right? The space between two panels that audiences must bridge through closure. So to review, chiasmus is visual and spatial, bridge and mirror, recycled, playful, and indeterminate. And there isn't time to go through all these, but here are a few examples of chiastic texts, the kinds of texts that we could be inviting students to create rather than the more traditional linguistic texts that we oftentimes see in writing classrooms. And I'm going to just conclude here with a quote from Adam Banks and amplifying his voice, his call to make it the case that it is time to promote the essay to the dominant genre emeritus, to retire it as our main and sometimes only mode for students to develop the intellectual abilities and writing practices we hope they will. Cultural relevance, the speed of technological change, and the impact of technological change on communication practices, and the narrow bandwidth of what the essay enables us to do in the expanded communication landscape demand that we bring a richer array of writing and communication practices to use in its place. We need new methods that center the chiastic practices that will prepare students to be rhetorically dexterous boundary crossers, able to bridge and move with and across the radical media of the future. Thank you.